Hello, everyone, and welcome to PA 315, Management of the Federal Government. I am Dr. Kanan, the professor for this course, and this is the first of lectures that will be recorded and are available to you on Canvas within the module. And before we start with the lecture, I do want to go over what we are expecting for this week. And this week you will see you have several different things to do. And it's very important each week, because there's only 6 for this very truncated short semester, to stay ahead of everything, make sure you're paying attention to due dates, read the syllabus, and we'll get through this okay, and everyone will be happy, including me. So make sure that you're reading the syllabus and paying attention in the module what is expected each week. The beginning of each module has what's called a module overview, and that overview breaks down what is expected. So for example, this week we have 2 chapters that we're going over, chapter 2 and chapter 3. And the first lecture is this one on chapter 2, the Constitution. And then you will see the second lecture under chapter 3. And there will be a different recording for that chapter using these PowerPoint slides. These slides are available to you without my lecture, just to go through at your own pace, as well as you will see in each module. One important component of this course, and it's emphasized throughout the syllabus, is we are using the Revel by Pearson textbook and quiz system. So you will be taking quizzes that are part of the Revel online ebook. So the quizzes, the reading quizzes for each chapter, and there's one for each. We have 10 chapters for the semester. We're starting with chapter 2. That you will have to read through the chapter on your Revel ebook and then take the quiz in Revel. There is no quiz in Canvas for the chapter, for each chapter. It's 15 questions. Of course, it will help if you review the lecture first, but that's not going to be enough to do well on these chapter quizzes without reading the material, because it's 15 questions. It goes into some of the detail a little more thoroughly. Those scores then will be populated into Canvas automatically. The other quizzes that you're responsible for are called documentary quizzes, and they're 5 questions relating to the documentary assigned for the module. And each module is 1 week. So this week we have the documentary that's called The Four Horsemen. Pretty controversial. I wanted to start with something a little more controversial. I don't agree with everything in it. Is it a bit alarmist? Sure. But it's still an interesting perspective to consider, especially in a government course. So one thing to do well in the documentary quizzes that I stress is students make sure to read the 5 questions that I put in the module where you will see the documentary that's been embedded. So when you open up the documentary, not the documentary quiz, the documentary, which is before that in the module, you will see those 5 questions, and they relate exactly to what's on the documentary quiz. So I'm giving you a cheat sheet so that you can read what the questions are going to be on the quiz while you're watching the documentaries. I know they're long, they're about an hour and a half, but it's important to watch them all the way through. The other element you're going to see with every chapter is there's going to be a short video. In this case, we have Madison v. Hamilton and the Beginning of Partisanship by Noah Feldman. It's a TED Talk. Those are very important to watch because they integrate the material that we're learning about the chapter. They add some context, but they're also going to be on the exams. So make sure that you are watching those videos. So that being said, let's get started with the first chapter lecture. And that is chapter 2, the Constitution. As you will have read, or are going to read in the text, a major circumstance that led to the drive for independence among the colonies in the Americas, the British colonies in the Americas, was the activities of the French and Indian War. And this was the 7-year war between France and Great Britain. And it manifested as well with fighting in the colonies here in the Americas. And the French had several native alliances that were fighting for the French against the British, against what is now the United States. And this became very expensive. And so the British government, as you will read, created lots of ways to build revenue. And they built revenue through taxation. And one way that they were doing this was taxing colonial goods. These are goods coming in and out of the colonies, and putting trade restrictions on the colonies so that they had to buy British-based products, British-produced products, to increase revenue and the economy back in the UK. Obviously, this was not very popular in the colonies, especially since they didn't have any representation in Britain to vote whether to impose taxes on themselves. So as these things started to create some of the resentments in the colonies, you had committees of correspondence that were set up, and they helped to build this public opinion against Great Britain. Some of the more nastier acts that the Great Britain put forth were the Coercive Acts of 1774. This, of course, is after the Boston Massacre, as you'll read in the text, of 1770, and some other instances, famous one, the Boston Tea Party. King George, instead of thinking, oh, let's try a way to appease the colonies, said, screw them, and help with Parliament to create the Coercive Acts, which here in what became the United States were called the Intolerable Acts, and created further resentment in the colonies. One of the major issues, which they had done before, but this actually increased the amount, was quartering of British troops. And that means that British troops would come here to basically quell any resistance to British rule, and they'd be forced to stay with colonists' families. So not a very popular situation there. The First Continental Congress was in September 1774. Obviously, this was pushed by the Coercive Acts and the other previous events that you will read about in the text. And this created a Declaration of Rights and Resolves for English Cooperation. So the emphasis with the First Continental Congress, these meeting of these different colony representatives from the various colonies, had an emphasis on reform under British rule. So they still wanted to serve under the king, but they wanted reform. Of course, this was not met with much pleasure. King George said, screw them again. And the Second Continental Congress was set up for May of 1775. Once again, they tried with the Olive Branch Petition in July 5th, 1775, to offer some sort of compromise with the king, and the king wasn't for it. King George III said no thanks, and from then on, this set about what became the revolution and separation from Great Britain. But it wasn't only what was happening through through Congress, the Continental Congress, this these colonial representatives, but also the public support gained tremendous push for independence through many things. One of the largest influences was Thomas Paine's Common Sense, and that was a book in half the households making a case for independence. Benjamin Franklin was a publisher. As you'll read in the text, Benjamin Franklin had also met prior in the 1750s to talk about independence from Great Britain. So he was a proponent for that for many decades prior to this. But he produces this book basically setting out the reasons for separation from Great Britain. And with 50% of households gathering that, think of it today, if you have something go viral, let's say on the internet, usually that's 3 to 5% minimum among a population are exposed to this. And that's, a big number when you think of how, 330 million people here, et cetera. Think of 50%, much exponentially higher. So this definitely was very, a primitive going viral here to a major extent. So Declaration of Independence, this was put together by the Committee of Five. You had John Adams of Massachusetts, who later became the second president, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, Robert Livingston of New York, and Roger Sherman of Connecticut. They were called together to draft a Declaration of Independence. And this was after, as you will or have read, Virginia had already decided to secede from Britain, and then the other colonies, got together to draft a uniform Declaration of Independence for the remaining 12 colonies. Thomas Jefferson is cited as a principal author for that. It didn't come out of thin air. A lot of the verbiage used and the concepts, these were from several different philosophers. You have Rousseau in France, and then you also have the British John Locke, political philosopher. The social contract theory plays a large role. So a person's moral or political obligations are dependent upon a contract or agreement to form a society in which they live. So consent of the governed, there was also a strong emphasis of Rousseau. You have life, liberty, and property, these things to be protected, coming from John Locke philosophy. Reason, which is that law teaches all mankind who would but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. So we are skipping through lots of material in the text. This is why I'm saying it's important to read the text because it's a lot of material each week, and you're going to be covering 2 chapters a week. So make sure you're staying ahead in the readings. So ultimately, 1781, Britain decides it's over, and the new United States of America is formed, and the Constitution as we know it obviously was not. It was ruled under the Articles of Confederation. These were far different, and we'll discuss that in a second, from what we now know as the framers and the Constitution in the United States government. So the United States government is formed, the United States of America, but it's under the Articles of Confederation. It's a confederacy, and it's very different. One of the main differences with a confederacy is that the states hold the power collectively. The federal government is very weak. The federal government is just there to serve the states and has very little power. So there's no power, the federal government has no power to tax, so it can't create revenue, has no power to regulate commerce. So each state can create their own rules on commerce, on trade with different nations or between the states. There is no executive branch to implement laws. So there's no infrastructure, as far as administrative infrastructure to carry out any sort of implementation of a law. There's no federal judicial system, so no courts at the federal level, everything's at the state level, and no coercive power over states because they are beneath the states. They are formed as a product of the states. The states create the federal government and have power over it. Didn't work well in practice You had a lot of issues as discussed in the text. You see this cute little picture here. It's not quite accurate, the Shays Rebellion, because you had Shay was a former military commander in the revolution, and many former what they called the Continental Army, those who fought to fight Great Britain for independence, were promised lots of money and rewards from the this new government, the United States of America. Unfortunately, that never came to be. And during a recession in Massachusetts, these farmers who were waiting, had fought and perhaps were injured or trauma, were waiting for this money from the federal government that never came. And they started seeing big business coming in and controlling the government in Boston for the state of Massachusetts, the Commonwealth. And they said, screw this. We're not paying these debts. You're not going to take and foreclose on our farms. You promised us money, the federal government did, and we didn't get it. And so they went to the tax collection office and took it over for almost a year. And there was no foreclosures. The federal government at the time, under the Articles of Confederation, really had no power, had no acting army. They tried to raise money to produce an army to go quell this, to stop this rebellion in Massachusetts, but none of the states would pay except for one. Finally, Massachusetts, the state itself, through private funds, raised enough money to have a private group of army come in and combat these 1,500 former Continental Army people. So this showed that there's a lot of issues and problems under the Articles of Confederation, and something needed to be done. So what happened is, initially they get together, the Constitutional Convention. They want to at first revise the Articles of Confederation, but quickly some states, especially larger states like Virginia, wanted a whole new plan. And so Virginia came with a plan of its own, and this would create a powerful central government, a federal government, and the representation would be based on population. And we'll go through some of the differences between Articles of Confederation and the Constitution in just a second. The New Jersey plan, at the time, New Jersey was a very small state, not just in size, but population. When we say large or small, it's mostly population based. They wanted to keep things as they were and have a weak central government. They were scared of the large states taking over and dictating their lives. And they wanted to keep the representation by state, because under the Articles of Confederation, each state got one vote. So the 13, would have one vote to pass anything. You needed 9 votes. It was difficult to get to that 9. The Great Compromise, some would say, came from the Connecticut plan, but it still carried a lot of the Virginia plan in structure. This was put forth, and it created a bicameral legislature. So no longer would have a unicameral legislature. It would have bicameral, so 2 houses within the legislature. And the first house is the House of Representatives. And in the House of Representatives, as we know, the number of representatives is based on the population. At the time, it was 30,000. Now we're at 700,000 plus, how things have changed. And that would be directly elected by the people. Prior representatives to Congress were just, the state would decide who goes. There was no elections for the people. The Senate, however, would have equal number of votes for each state, which became 2. And so it doesn't matter the largest, highest populated state or the lowest, they'd all have 2. So it gives an advantage to the smaller states, a tremendous advantage, actually. The Senate at the time, though, were elected by state legislatures. So the state legislature would, not the federal, would vote on who becomes a senator for the state. And that didn't change till 1913. So the Senate was always considered more of an elite group. They had 6-year terms. House of Representatives have 2-year terms, and more of the representing the people in general. The Constitutional Convention also called for a division of power between national or federal and state governments, and gave supremacy to the federal government. And that, of course, remains to this day, where the federal government, the Constitution, is superior to any state constitution or city charter or county charter. It's the Constitution that matters first. It has the supreme power of the land. The states cannot contradict the federal Constitution. So who were the framers? Some would say founding fathers. If you read in the text, they prefer framers. I do too. Framers were this group of people who got together. We consider the founding fathers, and put together this Constitution and had it implemented within 3 years, which for the time was pretty amazing. Well, they were wealthy white male property owners. And as you see the breakdown, the occupations of the framers, they were majority lawyers. So not much has changed, unfortunately. Says some were slave owners, many were slave owners. Relatively educated, most were young by today's standards, but not quite by the standards of the day at the time. People didn't live as long generally. Social motives, as it talks about in the text, a lot of us grow up and we're taught of all these great and honorable things, and there's maybe some truth to that, but also there was an emphasis by these wealthier men to maintain social order. The Shays Rebellion scared them. Oh, you're telling me that people aren't going to be paying back their debts, etc. They wanted to maintain social order, and they had economic motives. They felt that a weak federal government and not having centralized control of commerce, leaving it up to the states, etc., is not good for business and trade with other nations. So the mercantile system, which had worked so well in Britain, they wanted to recreate something like that here. The Americas was full of natural resources, and they wanted to have America prosper and progress. The issue of slavery in the North, you already had some people, Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, some others who were for abolition of slavery. Unfortunately, a lot of the South, which had a plantation economy, were to get them to support any sort of unified government as they had done in the Revolutionary War, and now with the Constitution and Articles of Confederation, there had to be a lot of compromises. And so one of which was they would, after 20 years, outlaw the slave trade, bringing people in as slaves to the United States, but slavery would continue with those born here. So it was kind of not the best solution, but better slightly than it was prior, but still horrible. And the 3/5 compromise, as you'll read in the text, after the southern states and these states with large slave populations were crying about ending slavery, and they wanted to continue the injustice and the savage practice because it fattened their wallets. They then said, well, we have all of these slaves and they are not counted as part of the population, but we want to make sure that we have a lot of representatives, and we're not going to be weak in the sense of representation within the House of Representatives. So then the 3/5 compromise comes around, which was equally disgusting, where it said those who aren't free men would, free persons would be counted as 3/5 of a person for the sake of population and the sake of basically using it as the amount of people in order to see how many representatives each state received. And at the time, because of the 3/5 compromise, then the southern states all of a sudden had about 45, 47% of the Congress representatives. So they were happy there, but many others living in the South were not. So federalism, that's power divided between national and state governments. It's practiced here, not everywhere, but it is fairly common in the world. So the national or federal government is considered supreme, and power is derived from the people in this new United States government, not from the states. Separation of powers within the federal government. You have the executive branch, the legislative branch, and judicial branch. Each have their own unique jobs and powers and oversight over the other groups. Congress, obviously, what they are primarily focusing on is creating laws and passing laws. The president carries out the laws, enforces the laws, and the courts, the judiciary, their job is interpreting the laws. So checks and balances that were built into this system and have survived till today, I'll just go through a few here, make sure that there's some checks on power. So Congress, as we know, can override a president's veto. They can impeach and remove a president, though as we've seen, it's very difficult because of the partisan nature of Congress. They can reject appointees, refuse to ratify treaties, reject presidents' requests for laws and funds, and can investigate presidents' actions, as we've seen in recent history. The president can veto bills passed by Congress. If the president does that, then Congress needs a 2/3 supermajority to pass the bills, which, as we know, in the partisan landscape of Congress, is very, very difficult. President can recommend legislation, but again, cannot pass it. It has to go through the legislative branch and through all the committees and everything else. The vice president presides over the Senate and votes to break ties. The Supreme Court can declare actions, or any federal court can declare actions of a president unconstitutional. Ultimately, the Supreme Court has the final say. The president has checks on the courts. He nominates the judges, as we've seen, and not only federal judges, but this, of course, the Supreme Court justices, who then have to be passed by the Senate. The president can pardon persons convicted in federal courts, not in state courts, however, just federal courts. Congressional check on courts. The Congress, of course, can reject judicial nominees, and that has happened before. And that's not just for Supreme Court, but for other federal courts. Can create new lower federal courts, can amend laws and change court interpretations. So if there's interpretations by the federal courts that they don't agree with, they can go back and amend the law, or can propose constitutional amendments, which is very difficult, as we'll discuss. But still, they have the power, and they can impeach and remove judges. So the same impeachment process could happen with either a federal judge, but it also could happen with the Supreme Court justice. So looking at Articles of Confederation in the US Constitution, compared side by side, we see that the formal name of the nation is articulated in the Articles of Confederation, the United States of America. Actually, in the Constitution, it's not, except it does refer in the preamble as the United States of America. So I guess there was that assumption. Legislature, your Congress, was unicameral, meaning there's just one house and just representatives from each state. Now we have the bicameral, also called Congress, divided into the House of Representatives and the Senate. The members of Congress, it depended on each state, but between 2 and 7 members per state, but they only got one vote. Now, as you know, we have 2 senators per state, and then representatives are, according to the population, it's around 800,000. Voting in Congress is, you get 1 vote per representative or senator now, rather than just each state. Appointment of members. These in the past, all of Congress was appointed by the state legislatures. And they could do it in any way they wished. Now representatives are elected by popular vote, and senators initially were appointed by state legislatures, but that was changed in the 17th Amendment, 1913. And now we vote for senators as well. Term of legislative office initially under Articles of Confederation, 1 year, which isn't a lot, and no more than 3 of every 6 years. They wanted to rotate people through there, so there wasn't much consistency. That was found problematic, so it was 2 years for representatives and 6 years for senators. And there's no term limits at the federal level, with the exception of the president. Okay, what else here? The major differences we've already discussed. There was no executive branch. However, there were presidents before George Washington. George Washington wasn't officially the first president of the United States. There were several, but the president prior to the Constitution from 1781 through 1789 was a position without really any power. They just presided over Congress, hence the name president. National judiciary, they did have a maritime judiciary established, but there was no other courts, no Supreme Court, nothing of that sort. That obviously changed with the Constitution. You had Supreme Court as well as federal courts. And if there's disputes between states, which happened all the time, you had states, as you'll read or have read, that went to war against each other during the critical time between 1781 and 1789. And at the time was Congress had to do something about it, but they had no power and no money. Now, with the Constitution, it changed to the Supreme Court, handles the disputes between states. New states, you needed 9 states to admit them. That was changed to just a majority of Congress. Amendments, every state had to agree with the Articles of Confederation. And then we have the different amendment rules with the Constitution, where 2/3 of Congress, so both the House and the Senate, 2/3 of each, and then 3/4 of the state legislatures have to approve an amendment. But amendments have to be brought through a proposal. We'll talk about that more later and later in the semester. And 3/4 of states means 3/4 of states have to approve it, though to approve it in each state is only, over 50%. It's a simple majority, but you need 3/4 of the states to have a simple majority in favor. We won't get too much into this. Navy and Army, Congress was authorized to build a Navy, but they had no money to pay for it. So the states were doing that. And this changed. The states were not allowed to keep ships of war with the Constitution. They wanted a central military. And the Constitution did allow states to have militias. However, authorized the Congress, the federal government, to raise and support armies there. The power to coin money at Articles of Confederation, you had the United States and the states, which was a problem. Each state was creating its own currency. The Constitution, it was just the federal United States only, one currency for all of the states. Taxes, we talked about before, had to be collected only through the states in the Articles of Confederation. They usually were not and were not paid. Whereas in the Constitution, Congress levies and collects taxes directly to the federal government. Ratification, initially, that means to approve it. It needed unanimous consent. However, the Constitution, the change to the Articles of Confederation, required 9 of 13 states. So, structure of the Constitution, there are 7 articles. Know the difference with each one. And that's in your text, and it'll be in the study guide as well. So, Article 1 talks about the legislative branch, about Congress. You know, the enumerated powers means those that are actually given within the article, as well as those that are implied. Necessary and proper clause is also called the elastic clause. And what this means is that they realize when they're writing Article 1 that there's going to be laws that haven't been created yet that are necessary in order to carry out the enumerated powers given to government. So any laws necessary to that end in the future are allowed, and that is called the elastic clause, and that includes enumerated and implied powers. Article 2, executive branch. So now we're talking about the president and commander in chief, and what constitutes that part, the branch of government, the term for the president. All of these things are in Article 2. And the authority to make treaties, federal appointments, etc. That's all broken down in Article 2. And we have a chapter with each one of these branches, so I won't get too much into this. We'll be talking about it later in the respective chapter. Article 3 talks about the judiciary branch, and Article 4 through 7 are the full faith and credit, supremacy clause, and amendment process. And full faith and credit, what that means is each state has to respect another state's laws, but not necessarily adopt their laws, but respect their laws. So for example, here's when we were looking at, let's say, gay marriage back, 10 years ago, when you had some states that approved gay marriage and some states hadn't. So if someone was married, if a couple were married in a state that allowed it, and they go to another state, even if that state does not, at the time, did not allow gay marriage, they had to honor the marriage based on the full faith and credit. And that goes for anything else. It doesn't mean that every state has to have the same laws. They just have to honor the others. Supremacy clause says that federal law is supreme over state law. And then you have the articles talking about the amendment process. Ratifying the US Constitution, of course, you had the different groups with different motivations, and you had the Federalists versus Anti-Federalists, and the Federalists, which was James Madison and Alexander Hamilton and several others, favored strong national government. The Anti-Federalists favored strong state governments. Now, you'll say, wait, James Madison, he sounded really anti-Federalist. When, in the TED Talk that we're watching this week, which is true, he and Hamilton initially worked together and wrote the Federalist Papers to convince the public with several, tens and tens of essays. They were working together to get this Constitution passed through. Remember, James Madison was one of the main architects of the Constitution, or the father of the Constitution. But once the Constitution was ratified, then you saw a separation in, in this beginning of this partisanship. And please, you watch that TED Talk. It does a great job of breaking down how we think everything is recent, this partisanship and the divide, but it's very similar. It's been going on since the beginning of our Constitution. You've had this separation between these two groups. John Jay also wrote 3 of the Federalist Papers. He later was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. They have a very prestigious college named after him in New York City. And winning support for the Constitution, Delaware was the first state. And it was interesting as the smaller states, Delaware and New Jersey, jumped on and ratified the Constitution first because they were actually afraid that they would lose the Senate, that Senate giving the equal number of senators for each state. They were very small states. They loved that concept. So they actually ratified it first, even though it was quite a change in favor of the larger states like Virginia and New York. New York actually took a long time in Pennsylvania. They like to debate there. And much of the discussions centered around having protections for civil liberties, which we'll talk about in a second. And that became the Bill of Rights. So differences between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. This is in general, this is a bit black and white here, the way the text has it written out. But Federalists generally were more likely to be property owners, landed rich, came here wealthy from Europe, merchants of Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. Elitists saw themselves and those of their class as most fit to govern. Alexander Hamilton comes to mind there. He was, didn't think that having the average person having a say and voting, he thought that could be a problem because they were, he thought, not the brightest. And type of government favored by the Federalists: powerful central government, 2-house legislature, upper house, 6-year term, the Senate, further removed from the people. These are, kind of like ancient Rome with the Senate. You had the Senate for the kind of the elite, and they were appointed, and then you had the other house, the House of the People, or the plebeian house in Rome that represented everybody else. And so they had kind of that same type of attitude. Alliances they were pro-British and anti-French. And that's kind of a generalization. That's not completely true for the Federalists. The Anti-Federalists were small farmers, shopkeepers, laborers, decency of the common man. They wanted more participatory democracy. They obviously favored the Articles of Confederation to give more powers to the states and not to a federal government. They thought the big cities, they were scared of urban environments and cities, and they viewed those elites in urban areas as corrupt and awful. And they were very pro-French and anti-British. So how do we amend the Constitution? The formal method, you need 2 stages. First is the proposal. Any Joe Schmo can't just propose a constitutional amendment. It has to be proposed in a certain manner. So 2/3 members of both houses, so Senate and House, can vote to propose an amendment, or 2/3 of state legislatures, which has never happened. So we've never had an amendment come from the states, from 2/3 of state legislatures, and pass that way. It's never been done. It's always come through the 2/3 members of both houses. Ratification is the second stage. So it's proposed, it's out there, and then it has to be ratified. So you need the vote in a ratifying convention. That's the 2/3 of both houses. And then you need the vote in the state legislatures, which is 3/4, 3/4 of the states have to have a simple majority yes to be ratified. And that can take a long time, as you have read or will read in the text. Equal Rights Amendment, which picture to the left, went through Congress for decades and decades and decades, finally was ratified by 2/3 of both houses, and then went to the states, and then they had 10 years to have the states approve it. Unfortunately, only 35 states did. And so in 82, I believe, that it died there, though there is talk of putting through a law that extends that 10-year to, it's going to have to be about 50 or 60 years in order to have the rest of the states approve the ERA, Equal Rights Amendment. Informal methods are obviously judicial interpretation. So Supreme Court can decide if laws are unconstitutional. We've seen this over and over. with segregation. We saw it with abortion. We've seen it with gay marriage and many, many other subjects. Social and cultural change. Legislation can alter balance of power between government and states, and that goes back and forth. You had this push for state power in the 80s and 90s, and you have this back and forth between more power to the states, more power to the federal government. Technology is a big changer of the Constitution, whether it wants to or not. We're seeing that now with media, and the different forms of media and the internet is redefining free speech. And finally, the Bill of Rights we'll talk about briefly, because we're going to be going through this when we talk about civil liberties in a different chapter. So this I'm just putting to have it in one spot, and then you will have later chapter going over it more in depth. So again, we talked about the anti-federalists, these group of people who were against this new, large, strong federal government. They wanted to protect civil liberties. So the first thing that Congress comes in 1789, they put through the 10 amendments, first 10 amendments to the Constitution all at once, and these were to address civil liberties primarily. So First Amendment, we see Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So the first thing is to deal with religion. They didn't want the country to be beholden to a religion as most European nations were, but also they didn't want government to prohibit free exercise. So freedom of religion to practice whatever you want. And then you get to speech, then you get to press, and then peaceful assembly, and petition the government for redress of grievances. So they have to have that element. There has to be a way for you to go to governments with a problem. Second Amendment, you have a well-regulated militia, and that's for the states. So this allowed the states to still have militias, organized and well-regulated is the key there. And the right of people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That is pretty vague, and that's been controversial for decades and generations. Some feel that it means that everyone can keep and bear arms, and that's pretty much where we are now politically. Though many now believe that it's a well-regulated, regulated is the key word, militia, and the people to keep and bear arms as part of the militia. So it can be interpreted a number of ways. Third Amendment, no soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. So we get off right away how unpopular the quartering of soldiers was. They said, no, we're not going to have that here, no how. And so that's our Third Amendment. Fourth Amendment, the right of people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation. So you need a warrant, and the government can't just seize property. And we have some issues with that, which we may discuss later in the semester. And the warrant, has to be specific relating to what is searched, which persons and things, and etc. Fifth Amendment, no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia and during times of war, etc. So this basically saying that you can't just have government, someone with a axe to grind or vendetta, out there who's a prosecutor and arresting all of his enemies. This means you have to have a grand jury to decide who is indicted. And also part of the Fifth Amendment, you've heard the term plead the fifth, is that someone cannot be compelled in a criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. They didn't want people to be thrown in and threatened and then coerced into saying something. And no nor shall private property be taken for public use. So this is an extension of the Fourth Amendment here, without just compensation. Sixth Amendment, speedy and public trial, impartial jury of peers, etc. Seventh Amendment basically says the right of a trial by jury shall be preserved as long as it's more than $20. You can see that's an old figure there. And there's been several laws adding to the Seventh Amendment, of course, over the years in each state. Eighth Amendment, excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. So we often think of cruel and unusual punishments, but the excessive bail issue was taken up in California recently, and we see that California is no longer having these large bail being set up because they feel it's not fair for those who don't have the money to bail themselves out. Ninth Amendment, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. Basically, what that's saying is what's in the Constitution enumerated, the laws explicitly, that's not all of the rights of the people. There's other rights as well. So someone can't say, well, it's not in the Constitution, so we can do whatever we want. There will be other laws at the state level everywhere else. Then the 10th Amendment clarifies this as the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So this is saying, okay, there's lots of things we can't cover everything, and those powers not delegated here in the Constitution or implied are reserved to the states. So that is the lecture, the first lecture this week. You have one more on chapter 3, and I will be posting these every week with your module. You will see the new lectures, and make sure that you're also reading and completing the documentary quiz, and we will get through this painlessly and then hopefully enjoy it. Thank you.